Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Craig Reucassel. Coming up, a defiant Pauline Hanson attacks the media as the PM backtracks on preferences.
You have come here baying for my blood and I will not give it to you.
Tech industry heavyweights slam Australia's encryption laws, saying Australian tech is paying the price.
The customers are asking, please don't put my data in Australia. That's saying a lot.
And claims the agency that implements the NDIS is drastically underpaying its providers. Joining me on the panel, General Manager of Inclusion and Social Policy of the AFL, Tanya Hosch. Welcome back, Tanya.
Thank you.
Managing Director of Crescent Wealth and Islamic Super and Investment Fund and member of the Labor Party, Talal Yassine. Welcome to Talal.
Great.
Host of the feed on SBS, Fran. Hi, Jan.
Hi.
Director of the Gonski Institute for Education at the University of New South Wales, former Deputy Leader of the New South Wales Nationals and current Chair of the Griffith branch of the National Party, Adrian Piccoli. That's where it's all happening in the Griffith branch. And in Canberra, Social Affairs Reporter for The Australian, Rick Morton. Thanks for joining us, Rick.
Thanks, Craig.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum and on Facebook. Well, for weeks now, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has been resisting pressure from all sides to clarify how he would preference One Nation in the upcoming election. After a week of damning revelations of One Nation's involvement with the American gun lobby, the Prime Minister finally responded.
I've left it for a few days to see what the response of the One Nation leadership would be to those events. There have been further revelations overnight also, which have led me to the position this morning, having consulted with the party organisation. I've been in touch directly with them today and overnight, because ultimately this is a decision for the party organisation. But my recommendation to them, which they're accepting, is that One Nation will be put below the Labor Party at the next election by the Liberal Party.
The PM said he was shocked by secret recordings of Pauline Hanson, who said there were questions over whether the Port Arthur massacre was a conspiracy.
An MP said it would actually take a massacre in Tasmania to change the government.
Wow.
Haven't you heard that?
I hadn't heard that one.
Have a look at it. It was set up on Parliament.
No, it's that whole September 11 thing too.
Those shots, those precision shots, to them around. I've read a lot and I've read the book on it, Port Arthur.
Yeah.
No questions there.
Hanson's views have been widely condemned. The Alana and Madeline Foundation, named after two young sisters murdered by Martin Bryant, said,
The Foundation proudly supports the National Firearms Agreement, which has proven to reduce gun violence. We stand with the families whose lives were shattered at Port Arthur. We will keep working to protect children from violence. That is truly One Nation working together.
The less airtime we give these ridiculous comments from Pauline Hanson, the better.
These stories in the last few days have made it even more apparent why One Nation's bubble should be pricked. The best thing that people who are toying with voting for One Nation can do is not vote for One Nation.
Disgraceful, and it's just so disrespectful to the many victims of the Port Arthur massacre. I mean, imagine being a family member listening to that. Look, it's an insight into the scary world that is the One Nation Party.
These comments, along with the PM's declaration, were enough to flush out Pauline Hanson, who'd not appeared since the start of the week. A defiant Hanson blamed the media, saying the documentary was a setup, denied ever obtaining money from the NRA, and that the damning footage had been heavily edited.
Australian voters are asking if the Australian media are complicit in airing this false story. There is no question in my mind that Martin Bryant was the only person responsible for the murders of 35 innocent lives. One Nation will never water down gun policy in this country. For 23 years, I have been targeted by the media with their biased political agenda, who have not bothered to report the full facts or give me a fair go.
She's also standing behind her two controversial sidekicks, James Ashby and Steve Dixon. So, Tanya, no apology, blame the media. Are you surprised by this?
Not really. I wish I was. I mean, I think I'm still shocked by what happened in Tasmania. I remember hearing that news for the first time and couldn't believe that that was happening in the country that I call home. I think one of the things that makes me a proud Australian is our gun laws and what they have achieved. I mean, far be it from people in football to be telling political leaders what to do and what to say, but certainly we take responsibility for trying to set a good example when it comes to standing up against racism or any kind of hatred at all, and we'll continue to do that. And I guess it's my expectation as a taxpayer that our political leaders will stand for the right things as well.
Well, Pauline Hanson did say today that she believed Martin Bryant was the only person responsible for the deaths of 35 people. But it's interesting that the press conference, at the press conference, Pauline Hanson said it was heavily edited and taken out of context. Now, I mean, obviously there's editing there. Seeing the parts that have been said, do you think that could be taken out of context, Jan?
Look, I'm sympathetic, I think, on some level to people who do say that I appeared on a television program or I was interviewed for half an hour and only a certain snippet made it to air. Sometimes I think that those kind of, saying that might be reasonable. I'm genuinely curious as to what she actually meant when she said what she said, because I'm not quite sure how you could interpret it in any other way other than she has doubts about who perpetrated the Port Arthur massacre and that it was potentially a government conspiracy to water down, to change the gun laws drastically in this country. So look, I'm open to the idea that she was very heavily edited. I'm just not sure what she said originally, that they got that out of it from.
Yeah, Rick, what do you think? I mean, it's interesting this because no matter how you kind of take it, they're talking about, James Ashby's bringing in September 11 conspiracy theories and that. It seems fairly hard to believe that there was a different conversation than I think most people have seen coming out of that footage.
Well, yeah, and I think her press conference today was a perfect example of that because it had more kind of points in a dodecahedron and you could take any bit of it out of context, but you didn't, those were fully formed sentences that they were speaking and we didn't take the individual words out of context. I mean, they said it. They were asking for $20 million from the NRA and then they came back here and kind of used weasel words to try and talk about there being a foreign influence in Australian elections. And they were right. It was them. They were the ones seeking foreign influence. They said it. It's on tape.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it doesn't get much more clear than that.
It's interesting you mentioned the 20 million because let me play you what Pauline Hanson said in 2001 about Port Arthur.
We do not support any conspiracy theories regarding Port Arthur or Martin Bryant. We do believe that he has been convicted of this and he's been charged over it, and that he is guilty of the offence and the crime committed at Port Arthur.
It's interesting because in the past she said there's no conspiracy. She said that today, and yet behind closed doors saying different things. Adrian, do you think that's the context of thinking she's talking to somebody who might give funding to the party and who she thinks has a different view?
Well, I mean, this is just the latest kind of outrage from One Nation. I mean, this is not the only reason to put them after Labor, if this is the question for the coalition. There's 25 reasons to put them after Labor. This is just the 26th reason. So even if she was taken out of context, even if it didn't happen, you should still put them after Labor. I mean, I'm a National Party.
You're a National Party member?
MP.
Apparently it all comes down to the local branch, so the Griffith branch would be obviously putting them
I'm
up.
actively involved in our democracy, and I encourage other people to do the same. But, if the question is, do you want One Nation with a greater voice in Parliament than you would want Labor, even from a Conservative voter? The answer is no, and I would put them after Labor. This is a question of values for political parties. And I mean, I would expect Labor to do the same. I mean, look, Labor preferenced the Shooters Party on the weekend in the New South Wales election ahead of the National Party and Liberal Party. I mean, it's a values question. So I think in that sense, both parties have done the wrong thing, and they should put these fringe parties well down the ticket at the end, preferably. But as somebody said, you can always get somebody crazier than One Nation. But I have much more faith in the Labor Party forming a good government than I do with one that would involve the inclusion of One Nation.
Talal, it's interesting. Scott Morrison's argument today was, look, I've been watching how One Nation responded to this before I made this statement. Do you think, what do you think he was waiting for them to do that would have made it seem like, it's okay to put One Nation ahead of Labor? I mean, do you buy that argument?
Well, I think it's not sustainable or something that the electorate could tolerate anymore. on Walid Ali, if I may answer, because this is why we're talking about one nation today. It's because a number of things, there's a white supremacist argument, and that's our white supremacist, as far as I'm concerned, party. And Scott Morrison went on with, I should not mention another show on this show,
it's fine, you can
on the project, and he...
Don't switch over, people. It's
yeah, don't switch over. It's much more interesting here. I'm here. And so it's Craig. No. So he refused outright to say, he said all the right things, defending himself, how close and how good he was with the Muslim community, but he refused to do what our southern cousins did so well, and they should have embarrassed us into what the Prime Minister of New Zealand did, which is make the Muslim community feel safe in their own country. And when he was asked a fundamental question, do you stand with all Australians, or do you stand with one nation for purely political purposes? He said, look, I'm not sure. This is a matter for the party. The Prime Minister of the country, the leader of their party. This is not a question for me. This is a question that we need to determine on a blah-blah basis. The Muslim community took that as support for Islamophobia in this country. And whether, it is acknowledged or not, we're talking about one nation tonight. Even one nation's response to what happened with Al Jazeera. It was a hit, their message was that it was a hit report or hit job by a foreign Arab nation. It's like saying ABC doing a report and it was a hit job by the Australian intelligence on anything they report about. The language is that we use so casually and that they use now so casually, that's part of our lexicon, is so racist in its intonations that we accept. And for me, sitting here today on the panel, we're talking about one nation and gun control, but Christchurch only happened, 10 days ago? The New Zealand community is still mourning what an Australian did in our cousin's territory and still trying to come to terms with it. We as a nation have moved on. We have moved on. And this to me, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are the same side of one coin.
Do you think, Jan, this is the distinction that Prime Minister's tried to be drawing for the whole week, is that, look, it's out of my hands, it's the parties that set these preferences, and now he's said, look, I've changed it. I've told them to do this, and they've changed their mind. It's kind of changed very quickly on a dialogue. Do you think that kind of distinction he was trying to draw is just too subtle, really, for the community?
It's funny. He says it's out of his hands, but he turned it around pretty quickly after this whole thing happened.
So in his hands.
The Prime Minister.
Yeah, it seems very much that it is in his hands rather than out of his hands. I think what's interesting is that he's come out very publicly and very staunchly now and said that he will preference one nation after Labor. He didn't do that when Pauline Hanson wore a burqa in the Senate. He didn't do that when Fraser Anning used the term final solution in the Senate in regards to a religious minority. He didn't do that when Pauline Hanson put forward that motion of it's okay to be white, which started on 4chan, God help us all, and it is a very well-known kind of white supremacist slogan. He didn't do that when Pauline Hanson called Islam a disease, but he did do that very, very quickly after these heinous comments, and I think rightly so. But it's just interesting to see what motivates the Prime Minister to finally say, OK, we are going to take a stand on one nation.
It's interesting that, and Adrian, I want to come to you on this, because obviously there's some real politic behind this about the National Party particularly in Queensland, does not want to put one nation last. It wants to put one nation ahead of the Labor Party, and as a matter of fact, that may have an impact on actual seats in Queensland. So there's the real politic of that there. There's also, I think, some people are saying it's just because it suddenly became not a race issue, it became about Port Arthur, people have changed. But Catherine Murphy, writing today, suggested, look, Scott Morrison couldn't go earlier. The pressure had to build up to this level. Do you think that's the case? Do you think that the Nationals would have rebelled had he tried to go in this early? If he'd said to Walid Ali or whoever had asked you this question over weeks and weeks, yes, that's fine, I'll put one nation last.
The challenge in regional areas is there's a lot of dissatisfaction, particularly with the major parties. We've just had a state election here. The National Party lost the two big Western New South Wales seats. The Labor vote in my electorate last time I saw it, the seat of Murray down in the southwest was lower than the Labor vote. Now, it used to be a safe Labor seat, a safe state Labor seat. The Broken Hill seat used to be a Labor seat. The Labor Party vote is in single digits there. So the National Party don't want to do deals with one nation. What they actually want to do is attract the voters who are going to one nation back to the National Party. This is why it's a fine balance, and I think that problem becomes even worse in Queensland. I'm no expert in Queensland politics, fortunately, but It's the Trump effect, and I think sometimes the chattering classes in the salons of the inner west or inner city Melbourne can be very dismissive of their concerns. I mean, we've seen this with Trump, and he may now get another 4 years. And this is the problem often with,
This is the interesting question, I guess, because Pauline Hanson was speaking very much to her supporters today, and she wasn't really fussed about what the chatting classes, as you said. And the question for I guess, Scott Morrison and for others who are running against them in Queensland is how do you actually change the opinion of those people that are her core there? Rick, you've written 100 Years of Dirt. You've written a lot about, the rural areas there. Do you think? Do you think there's any way to get those voters to kind of leave Pauline Hanson, or do they not listen to what's said by the other parties?
I think one of the big mistakes we made is thinking that One Nation is this kind of coherent policy-making machine. I mean, they are a party of grifters. They always have been. And every time the media particularly, but elites more generally, if I can use that blessed word, attack Pauline Hanson, her supporters grow stronger. They grow stronger in their resolve because it's the classic case of the insider attacking the outsider. Now, One Nation flips and flops all over the place. They don't actually have a coherent position. They don't care about gun laws. They just want $20 million from the NRA. They'll do whatever they're told if they get that money. If they got it from the Buddhist temple down the road, you'd bet they'd have a Buddhist policy at some description. Like, I guarantee it. Like, my hometown is in the neighbouring electorate to Lockyer, which is the highest vote for One Nation in the country. Every booth in my hometown and in my own council area voted One Nation second or first in the 2016 federal election. I know the people who vote for One Nation. They are not all monsters, but One Nation themselves have kind of just latched onto them because all they did was turn up and said, we're here. And I'm not, these people that vote for her are not stupid necessarily, but they're also not plugged into the daily debate. They don't care about who won the day in question time. They don't care about the conversations we're having right now. They couldn't care less. All they care about is paying the bills. Can they afford it? And that's the nexus. I think the major failing of progressive politics in Australia is the grievances of the middle class. I mean, we have dismissed genuine working class people with real concerns for way too long by our own kind of grievances with language and things like that. And I think that's the problem.
It's interesting, though. Pauline Hanson's not happy. Pauline Hanson's not happy, as you can see, not happy about this, because she knows that this is really bad for her and it will drive people away. She would much rather this not have happened. So she can kind of be in that kind of amorphous, talking about conservative stuff and, pulling those people away from the right. She's worried about this, that it's actually going to do her party harm. That's why she's gone all out blaming the media, etc. Because she doesn't want to be far too extreme enough to be able to peel votes away, and she's worried this is going to hurt her.
Well, it is interesting, and I'll come to you on this, Tanya, actually. This isn't the first time that One Nation leader has polarised the electorate with her unorthodox views.
I belong here as much as much as what you do. Now, just because you're an Aboriginal is a weak excuse.
Please explain. Along with millions of Australians, I am fed up to the back teeth with the inequalities that are being promoted by the government and paid for by the taxpayer under the assumption that Aboriginals are the most disadvantaged people in Australia. I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians. Now we are in danger of being swamped by Muslims who bear a culture and ideology that is incompatible with our own. Therefore, I call for stopping further Muslim immigration and banning the burqa.
We have a disease. We vaccinate ourselves against it. Islam is a disease. We need to vaccinate ourselves against that.
I would also hope the Senate does the right thing and acknowledges it is indeed okay to be white. There will be no more increase to the welfare payment. Get a job and start taking responsibility for your own actions.
How do you react to the gay Mardi Gras?
I don't like it because it's promoting something, okay, that is not natural. Marriage, as interpreted by the Farmers' Federation, was between a man and a woman.
Vaccinations, the vaccination program, you've spoken about that and you've talked about a link with autism.
I advise parents to go out and do their own research with regards to this.
Vaccinations save lives, clearly save lives. And if
like
you're promoting an anti-vaccination campaign,
like
that
all
could
these
cost
other,
lives.
like all these other drugs that we've had over the years that have actually destroyed people's lives as well.
So, Tanya, Aboriginals, Asians, Muslims, gays, vaccinations, it's all based on a fear of something else, fear of, something else there. How do we respond to that? How do we overcome that politics of fear?
I think going back to what Rick was just saying before, it's really easy, I think, to tap into people's underlying fears, particularly when you're talking about people who do feel unheard themselves, who may not fit across any of those categories that Pauline Hanson has called out over the many years. But people who feel unheard, who feel like they've got their own struggles and feel like no one's hearing those, they're not hearing those spoken about, and even if they are being spoken about, they're not reading the same newspapers I probably read, they probably don't have the time to do that. If you generate more fear on top of fear, you will always find people willing to stand with you because they don't feel represented well by anybody else. And I guess what I see in all of this is how important the broader national leadership is in terms of calling this stuff to account and calling it to account very, very quickly. Because even in football, what we see is, because of Michael Long's stand, we rarely hear about vilification on the field amongst players anymore. So calling it out really worked. Now we're seeing it on social media platforms, and what will always happen is that that there's going to be more racist abuse and more hate speech when you hear it in the broader context of media and it's not held to account straight away. And so we do need our Prime Minister, our opposition leader, any representative of Australian people to be very, very clear about where they stand, because these words aren't nothing. It's not a consequence-free thing to attack someone because of who they are, what they believe. It does actually impact on people. And, I can share for myself that, it's not even the worst racist thing that you hear that upsets you. It can just be the next one that pushes you past the edge. And then you find yourself back in the schoolyard as a 7-year-old being teased because you look different to anyone else. And I have heard that from many people. It's certainly my experience. I consider myself pretty well informed. Australian, I contribute into my community. I love the work that I get to do. I feel really strongly about it. But the thing that I think is so damaging is this idea that people can say these things and they've got the rights to share these opinions, but you don't actually have the right to act on them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting how sometimes we disregard. We say politicians don't have an effect. We don't listen to them. But Talal, do you think that what politicians say and what they call out actually does set the kind of groundwork? It sets the kind of rules for the conversation in the national context.
Well, for me, what they do is absolutely critical. What they say and how they behave and how they act, as Tanya just said, it affects you in so many different ways. So I can tell you the Australian Muslim community, as a proud Muslim who is engaged in the broader Australia, who is engaged in contributing to the social fabric of Australia generally, you are taken back to the 7-year-old in the playground. And we turn around and we look for our Prime Minister to say, in this really difficult time, because for an Australian and for a Muslim, you can't win. If some idiot walks down the street called Muhammad does something bad, well, you're in jeopardy and you're in trouble because you're tarred with the same brush. If some idiot does the same thing that happened in Christchurch, well, you're again in the gun, so to speak, pardon the pun. The point is, the Prime Minister came out and Bill Shorten's came out, but where is leadership? Where is what the Prime Minister of New Zealand's doing, Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister Ardern, to make us feel, and it brings tears to your eyes about what she has done around the world. That's what leadership looks like.
No, I think it's been an extraordinary change.
And what the average Australian is doing. And this is where I get to the point of Australia is of two parts. There is the Australia that I know that is tolerant, open, brilliant, accommodating, and there is the lesser angels of us. and we're letting the lesser angels win. And so for Australia, what I'm saying is, I mean, Parliament sits, I think, returns on the 1st of April, next Monday.
Yeah, it's budget time, yes.
2nd of April is the budget. I call on the Prime Minister and Bill Shorten to stand up and say, hey, we're going to call this out as a nation, number one. Number two, we're going to ban Islamophobia. You know, it's still legal to discriminate against a Muslim in this country for being Muslim. It's actually legal. Don't worry about the 18C argument. There's nothing stopping someone saying, I'm discriminating against you because you're Muslim. Number three, this so-called Australian terrorist, alleged Australian terrorist, where is the Prime Minister saying, we're going to check if he has dual citizenship and we're going to explore whether we are going to strip him of his citizenship? Where is all the outrage? Where is all the recognition of how it's going to affect?
There's been a fair bit of outrage over this from all the parties.
No, I'm talking about the Prime Minister. We're talking about leadership here. There's been extreme outrage from the population. The Muslim community is standing up saying, thank you, but the question we're talking about leadership.
Some, I guess, did compliment the Prime Minister and say, for instance, you know, calling it out as terrorism, which I think under different leaders may have been different in that situation. I'm not saying it was a faultless act, but yeah. Jacinda Ardern, I think, has taken a very different approach than many would see. What do you think, Jan?
Well, I just think, you know, in terms of we're discussing here the role of politicians in, you know, being complicit and or aiding or abetting Pauline Hanson and whatnot. I think what also needs to be discussed is the role of the media and the press. And that's to be discussed on several levels. We don't have the time to do it all right now. But the media is not a homogenous entity, I accept that. But hearing Pauline Hanson in her press conference say that she is always given a hard time by the media and that the media is always out to paint her like the bad guy, I think that is absolute rubbish. I have never seen a politician on my screen the same way that I see Pauline Hanson. She is on Sunrise on Channel 7 more times than I would care to count, frankly. It was interesting
that she'd attacked David Hosch today, and yet she's on Sunrise, been on Sunrise for years.
She's been on Sunrise potentially more than any other Australian politician. I mean, I'm happy for people to fact check that, but certainly extremely regularly. And a lot of the time, we saw that interview with David Hosch where he did go hard on Pauline Hanson, but a lot of the time, you know, I've seen him and he very much agrees with her policies and says things like, I'll happily drive migrants back to the airport with you, Pauline, right? So we've had this situation whereby I think the media, again, not homogenous, but we have Pauline Hanson on whenever we can because, and this is the other element of it that I think needs to be discussed a lot more, we exist in a 24-hour news cycle, right? And that's a relatively recent sort of phenomena, like certainly the last few years. And that is a cycle that feeds off outrage and it feeds off polarisation. And Pauline Hanson she is working that to her advantage like nothing else. And I think we really, really need to be aware of that.
Well, I'm not going to take any more criticism of the media, so we've got to move on. No, I'm kidding. Coming up, more headaches for the embattled NDIS with claims its agency is underpaying providers. More on that a little later. You're watching The Drum. Following the Christchurch massacre a fortnight ago, much has been debated about the role of the internet and the kinds of sceptics we've actually been talking about as well who lurk in the seedy corners of the web. Facebook has announced today it will ban white nationalist content from the platform and that people who run search terms associated with white supremacy will get results referring them to support groups. But how much should be controlled and how much should be open to the scrutiny of government agencies? Late last year, the government, with Labor's support, enacted laws to give intelligence agencies greater access to encrypted messages sent by suspected criminals. Now, industry heavyweights, including the co-founder of Atlassian, say it's Australia's tech that's paying the price.
The law has created uncertainty for our staff and our customers. It places the tech industry in a chokehold. At a time when the industry is trying to create jobs for the future, this poorly written law is putting jobs at risk. We recognise the government's duty to keep Australians safe. There are ways to do that without casting a wide net and jeopardising the whole tech community.
If you talk to people in the technology business, pretty much everybody is viewing Australia as a pariah when it comes to technology. People are reluctant to open up businesses here. Every single Australian employee can be asked by the government to put code in unbeknownst to the company they're working for and can go to jail if they let their employer know. Who would hire an Australian?
Labor has committed to amending the bill and commissioning an inquiry into the economic impacts should it be elected to government. For more, we're joined by a lecturer in the Department of Computing and Information Systems at the University of Melbourne, Suelette Dreyfus. Suelette, thanks for joining us. Let's just get ourselves across the kind of criticism here. They're saying that due to these new laws that were passed in December last year, and the tech companies are saying that they will no longer be wanting to keep data in Australia because it's too open. There's kind of a backdoor that's there now. Is this a big thing? Would this have a big impact in Australia if they did move their, do we have a lot of data? What's the impact of this?
Well, I think it's a multiple impact. So this legislation that was criticised roundly by virtually everyone from the community was pushed through by the government, supported by the opposition. It's bad for the Australian economy. It's bad in that it makes the country less secure, and there are alternatives thus that it didn't actually need to be used. In terms of what it could do, it's not just about this data that is consumer data that might have been stored here. The president of Microsoft told us today, we're not so comfortable actually doing that anymore. That's a big statement. And he's saying he's meeting with senior people in other companies, tech companies, who are telling him similar things. Also a big statement. You can imagine he sits around the table with some pretty important people. So it's not just that data, it's actually the bigger implications. And the bigger implications are not just that you wouldn't store data in Australia, but Australian products are not going to be trusted in the same way that they have been overseas. So Australian tech has had a really good reputation. We've got super talented people here. It's seen as, quite open, quite a clean industry, relatively speaking, and therefore you trust the products. But now you'd say, well, do you trust the products? Has the government actually, used this new legislation to backdoor products? We've seen companies from China that have exported products where the Australian government, where the US government has said, oh, we won't allow this to be used, this product in certain circumstances. Huawei comes to mind, because we don't trust that it's not backdoored. This is potentially exactly what's going to happen to Australian products overseas.
Can I just ask you, because some of the commentary today went a bit further than just talking about the products. Paul Shetlis, who we saw there earlier, said that people will see every single Australian employee as a potential fifth column, and he started talking about that they can come to us and supposedly put a code in, and then we're going to break the system, and we're not allowed to tell our employers, don't come to me, I don't know the ABC code, anyone. But is this the case? This seemed like quite a big beat up there.
Well, I mean, the problem with the legislation is it's deliberately written to be vague. And it's got huge secrecy provisions. Now, those two things in combination mean that it can't actually be easily tested in a public and visible way. So the government was warned it was very vague. It went ahead and the coalition pushed it forward anyway, knowing that it was vague, which means it was really a deliberate act. And this is how the ALP approved it when it sent it through Parliament. And yet, because you're not allowed to tell anybody if these requirements are put on you, it means that you can't actually say, well, I want to contest this in an open court to get a definition of, what does this vulnerability mean, or how do you define this? So I think this was done quite deliberately. And what's interesting about it is there were so many submissions. Just hundreds of people wrote to Canberra, and they wrote from industry. I mean, small businesses from Queensland came and gave evidence in front of the parliamentary committee. People from human rights groups, academic, technical experts, all across the board came and said, this is bad law, do not pass it. And the only people who really wanted this passed were a handful of politicians who had a political agenda of being able to wedge Labor as they saw it, and a small number of people in the intelligence agencies and a little bit of law enforcement who wanted to push it through in the bubble of Canberra. But there are actually plenty of people in law enforcement who may not be able to speak publicly, but who are very concerned about the implications of this legislation.
I mean, we should probably put it in that context, and I think it was seen in some ways as an attempt to wedge Labor. But the suggestion was that the spy agencies said 95% of the people watched by Australia's domestic spy agencies are using encrypted messaging service. Now, obviously, coming in off the back of Christchurch, we're talking about monitoring white supremacists or any kind of form of terrorism, and this was part of that debate. It was part of the national security debate there. So, I mean, Rick, what do you think? Do you think the government's more likely to go to the national security side of this, or will start listening to, large tech companies?
I mean, we can tell they don't really care too much about large tech companies. In fact, they think there are algorithms for things that don't actually exist. I mean,
they're talking about jailing them now, so you're probably right, aren't you?
Well, exactly. I mean, they couldn't care less. But I mean, you're right. They did wedge Labor, and Labor, in stunning fashion, rose to the occasion and passed the legislation. Look, I mean, there's always got to be a trade-off, right? Like, how much are you willing to trade off of your own kind of civil liberties to be protected? There's this great existential philosopher, Nick Bostrom, who talks about creating technology that could be used to kill us or create kind of mass casualties in the world. And there are only really 4 ways to stop it. 2 of them are not good. They involve killing everyone on Earth or just making no new technology at all. And the other 2 are creating a super global state as part of the panopticon, like this surveillance state where you can watch everything. And I don't think people are willing to accept that. And yet, you don't get there in one big jump, you get there bit by bit. And that's what this stuff represents. And I think it's quite scary, and particularly for journalists who are trying to do work, but also just regular, citizens who are trying to live their lives without the surveillance state peering in.
Because Suelette, can I just quickly come back to you, because you mentioned there that there are alternatives there, and I just quickly want to check that. Is that obviously, we want our cake and eat it too. We want protection of our internet systems, but we also don't mind if there's probably some checking of security, the people that are being monitored.
Sure.
Is there a way to do that isn't this?
So I mean, just in simple terms, would you rather have the software or the technology infrastructure that 1 million people use be backdoored in some way, which creates a cybersecurity nightmare because you've actually then created an opportunity for the really bad guys to get into all of those people's private information?
I understand that, but is there the alternative? What's the alternative?
Yeah, sure. I mean, traditional policing and investigatory methods allow you to even do things. I mean, if you have a camera over someone's keyboard, you have a warrant to go into their house, you have a warrant to tap their phone, you can actually, you can have a camera on how they actually type their password in.
But isn't the
you can
point
put key loggers in.
The point the security agencies are making is that people are only communicating via these protected, encrypted services, or that's the predominant for communication. So
sure, but that's not so that's true of the middle bit of the transaction. But if you actually capture the end bits, you don't need to break the encryption in the middle. The thing is that to capture the end bits, you actually have to have a target, a specific target. You're looking at 5 people in a ring who you think are doing something bad. Okay, fine. But not 24 million Australians who need to be backdoored.
Yes, okay. What do you think, Jen? I mean, where do you fall on this balance? Do you think that we've gone too far towards encryption, getting rid of encryption and opening it up to spy agencies?
It's such a hard one. I mean, normally I'd say, look, if ASIO wants to read my text messages, they're the most boring text messages imaginable.
Asia, that's not true, Jenny. That's not Asia.
95% of them is just me telling my husband to take the chicken out of the freezer. That is it, right?
It's a code for something, Asia.
Yeah, exactly. But, kind of jokes and lightness aside, I think this is, it's a really serious one because I think, and I would kind of really agree with Rick on this one, everything happens incrementally, right? Everything happens incrementally, and then suddenly we're in a surveillance state where you can watch everything, it's a complete dystopia and everything's on fire, right? That is always way down the track in the future. And we get there really, really slowly. And so, again, we're asking these questions that seem very viable and very reasonable questions of where is the balance? And I feel like those questions are going to be there every single step of the way.
I guess
and I have no answer to them is the really scary thing.
It comes back a lot too, as you say, you're giving away certain protections. It comes down really a lot to whether you trust the government, whether you trust these forces to be doing this. And that's a difficult one. Like, Adrian, do you think the government has, well, not the government, but the security agencies have the trust that people would support this at the moment?
I mean, I err on the side of kind of national security, and if they're the measures that you need to take to protect my children from a pedophile ring, then I'm okay with that. If you need to take those measures to protect them, the community, from other kind of heinous crimes.
Is there a line for you, Adrian? What is the line whereby you would say, actually, no, I'm not comfortable with that?
I don't know enough about the technology and the surveillance to know exactly where that line is.
Yeah.
But what would be the line to protect my child from some online predator or some pedophile ring? I just don't know. I don't think there is a line there. But I'm like you. They can read my emails if they like. But
Probably unlikely to be reading your emails.
Yeah, actually, I don't want them to read my emails.
But I'm sure they're reading mine. So
they're reading yours too. Okay. So, yeah.
It's okay. They're already reading mine.
I always assumed they were. I always assumed ICAC was reading mine.
But I think we're talking about where do you draw the line in terms of do you go ultimate security and protection with a centralised state looking at stuff, or do you have freedoms? I think the line's slightly different to that. I think, do you trust the tech companies or do you trust the government? Because at the moment, really, if we're on Instagram, social media, Facebook, the debate is really who do you trust? The debate about whether privacy and security and whether we want it or not is gone. We lost that 20 years ago, in my view. It's about, do you trust Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, WhatsApp, or do you trust the Australian government and ASIO? And I trust ASIO.
So I don't agree that that's the trade-off. I think you should only have to trust the mathematics, of encryption algorithms to have your privacy. Now, I mean, if government has a good reason to investigate someone, there are lots of techniques to use it. The only reason you'd really want to backdoor something at a central level that way is because you want to do mass surveillance. And you say, oh, it's a small thing, it's an incremental thing. But China has a social credit system that makes most Australians shiver. Right? And that is today. That's not an episode of Black Mirror sci-fi. That exists now, here, and it's being rolled out across the entire country. So this is not something in the distant future. And I guess the other thing you've really got to think about is the impact to the economy. These jobs in tech that will go away. These experts, tech people are we've already got reports of tech people leaving Australia because they have to, okay? These are jobs of the future, not jobs of the past. And if you've got a teenager and you're worried, how are they going to get a job? Because the jobs that we might have had when we started out don't exist in the same way anymore. Those entry points don't exist. Well, this is how. That's what those jobs are. And if they go away, Australia's poor.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. And I'd like to really thank our guest lecturer in the Department of Computing and Information Systems at the University of Melbourne, Suelette Dreyfus. Thank you, Suelette.
Thank you.
You're watching The Drum, and with me on the panel are General Manager of Inclusion and Social Policy at the AFL, Tanya Hosch, Managing Director of Crescent Wealth, Talal Yassine, host of the feed on SBS, Jan Fran, Director of the Gonski Institute for Education at the University of New South Wales, Adrian Piccoli, and in Canberra, Social Affairs Reporter for the Australian, Rick Morton. The Greens Party has proposed a 100% renewables target by 2030 as one of the key planks of its federal election promises. It's also committed to ending thermal coal exports within the decade.
Coal is the biggest contributor to climate change, and if we haven't got a plan to tackle coal, we don't have a climate plan, and neither party has a plan to tackle coal. In fact, the Coalition want to build more coal-fired power stations. Labor's silent on it. They're not prepared to stop new coal-fired power stations or coal mines going ahead. So we need to actually deal with that issue, and that's what we're doing.
One of the big roadblocks to quitting coal has been the capacity of renewables to deliver reliable power as well as the cost of storage. Today, a new report from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, a renewables research company, claims that the costs have fallen dramatically since the start of 2018, crediting technology, innovation, economies of scale and the competition for the drop. Talal, I want to come to you. You're involved in investment and this kind of stuff. The Greens have gone probably further than we generally see here because they're not just talking about changing the use of coal in Australia, it's also talking about getting rid of the export of thermal coal, which will generate $26 billion in exports this year. I mean, what is the financial consequence of this? How big is this?
So I'm obviously not only a recogniser of climate change, but I'm a supporter of any move that helps us reduce our carbon footprint. However, within a responsible economic framework and within a reasonable period of time.
So do you think this is in 10 years we're going to get rid of exporting coal? Is that a reasonable amount?
I don't think that's reasonable. I think it should be more than 10 years, but not much more, not 100 years. I think the Liberal Party position, Liberal government's position of building new coal-fired plants is absolutely crazy. I think the business itself has recognised and investment itself has recognised and is coming out and doing the job of government by writing policy. 15-year-olds, including my daughter, have been protesting about the lack of movement on climate change. I don't know what the Labor Party policy is on it, and I think they're pretty silent on it, but which is a lament of mine and a lament on a lack of leadership. So I'm not particularly familiar with the policy itself, but anything that moves in that direction, which is economically responsible, should be adopted. And it's absolutely crazy today that we don't have a national policy that we're halfway through.
Rick, can I just ask you, do you think that this plays at a strange time when, in the context of the debate about whether or not to put the Greens last, do you think it's interesting that they've given ammunition to the pits of the world who say they're very dangerous? Do you think this policy goes to the point that the Nationals will say it's dangerous?
Well, I mean, look, I'm a big fan of the planet, love living on it, and I think we should do everything we can to boost renewables, because really the market and the science is settled on that stuff. I mean, they are providing power, they are providing dispatchable power. Renewables are working. I'm not a fan of just shutting down coal overnight. I'm really not. I mean, A, because there are workers in those places. B, because it just doesn't strike me as being the smartest plan. If you can do both, build renewables while you've still got existing coal running, they're about to, to reach the end of their lifespan anyway, a lot of these coal-fired power stations. I think that's the smartest way to do it. And that's the thing that Labor's been trying to straddle as a party, trying to understand its workers' roots and protect the workers in those trade unions who are working in those industries, while also building up renewables for the future. If you get that transition wrong, then you've sent one train off and you've blown up the other, and it doesn't make any sense at all.
Tanya, do you think, I mean, it comes down to, again, jobs is an important thing here. Now, the Greens policy says that the jobs will be replaced by jobs in the renewable energy market. How do you think you make somebody who's working in a coal mine or is working in that, how do you think you make them confident enough that that's going to happen? And that's the difficult thing, is it? I mean, do you trust that, oh no, I'll get a job in this other industry?
Well, I think, I don't really want to go back to that last conversation because I'm inept in all things technology. But I do think there is something about transparency in everything that we do. When we're planning for change and we're asking and making expectations of people to accept that change and move with it and contribute to that, then I think having a transparency is a key way to build that trust. I think it's very hard for people to have trust if they can't quite see what the mechanics are behind, and certainly if they can't understand what the actual vision is and what the end game is. And I just think that we're living in a world that is rapidly challenging on all different fronts, and I think sometimes we're asking a lot of people to embrace a vision with no real certainty at the end, and not a lot of clarity about how we're going to get there.
And Adrian, I want to ask you about this, because that's it. You were in a rural area, you part of the National Party. Do you think that this policy from the Greens today, do you think there'll be any trust of it? Do you think that, how will it be seen in rural areas that have a lot of coal?
Well, I mean, the Greens don't get a great deal of support. I mean, I always find it interesting, the greatest support for the Greens comes from within 5 kilometres of the CBD of our major cities, in the wealthiest parts of the country with the highest house prices. There's not a lot of kind of support for Greens in disadvantaged communities. So, certainly
they're doing all right in Lismore.
Yeah. No, I get the problem. We get the Nats get outflanked to the left and in Lismore and outflanked on the right in Broken Hill. But I don't think the Labor Party doesn't support this either, because it doesn't really make sense. I mean, what Labor are trying to do is, what the Greens are trying to do is kind of what One Nation is doing on the other end of the spectrum, peeling votes off Labor. But I go back to the Pauline Hanson thing, right? There are people who are diametrically opposed and want to build coal-fired power stations in Queensland and all that. The question for really politics and mainstream politics is, why are these people peeling off? Why in the United States did they elect Trump? Why do people support Pauline Hanson? For some reason, the extreme stuff she says, but there are those other kinds of things around power prices, etc. And until the Coalition and Labor really deal with this issue of power prices, if you live in Newtown and you're on 200 grand as a lawyer, power prices don't affect you as much as if you're unemployed and you live in Bathurst. Now, we need to deal with why are these fringe groups, particularly on the right, getting the the support that they're getting.
Economic. We are going to have to unfortunately move on that. The federal budget is just days from hitting the printing presses, and one of the big line items will be the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which currently costs $22 billion a year to implement. The National Disability Insurance Agency will meet tomorrow, reportedly to approve substantial price rises for providers after claims it's been lowballing on rates. The changes won't come cheap, with the rate rise set to cost more than $500 million over the next 15 months. Rick, the Prime Minister is said to have personally insisted the agency lift its game. What's the deal here? I mean, is it because they were going to be embarrassed that there was actually a lot of NDIS money wasn't being spent, was going to be on the budget bottom line?
Well, that's part of it, except they do actually want a lot of that unspent money to be on the budget bottom line to help the deficit look a bit better. I mean, late last year, there was $2.5 billion of unspent money in the NDIS. That has definitely grown larger. That's for two reasons. It's running way behind schedule. And isn't actually going to be finished in 2019-20 when it was originally meant to. But also people who are in the NDIS now are only spending on average 65% of the money they are given in a support package. So, but the drama that Scott Morrison has involved himself in is the providers, so the service providers who provide services under the NDIS. I mean, this is their big money-making machine, essentially, and they were the National Disability Services, which is the peak body for them, was one of the key groups that actually got the NDIS off the ground. It was their campaign that convinced Gillard and Shorten. It was their kind of coffers that made it happen, and they've done it again this week. They've started this massive advertising campaign, and the coalition has listened to them because they're powerful. Never quite listened to the people who are using the NDIS who have had so many problems, and I could talk about it for 10 days.
That's one of my questions here, I think. Is this just responding to basically a powerful lobby group in terms of the providers? Is it going to have a flow-on effect in terms of helping those who are actually being provided the services through the NDIS, or is this not in any way linked?
In some cases it will. So you obviously need the service, you need the marketplace to be there, otherwise people don't get to spend their plans at all. But the government hasn't actually done much in terms of trying to steward that market and grow it. They've kind of assumed that a free market exists even when you're giving birth to the bloody thing. So, and we're not there yet because we need to grow the workforce massively. But, you know, there've been so many, I mean, the agency itself has been kind of cutting costs on plans. They've been reviewing plans early when people have money left on them, and then putting them onto another plan and essentially making sure that they lose money when they put them onto a lower rate. And so there's been all these decisions that they're not too keen to kind of answer questions on. In fact, I've now tried for 2 days in a row unsuccessfully to get that interview with Vicky Rundle, the Deputy CEO. But, you know, the government is, certainly at the end of last year when they updated their economic position, the $2.5 billion that wasn't spent in the NDIS added to the monumental turnaround in the country's fortunes, and they were hoping to do that again this budget.
Quickly, Jan, I'll come to you on this. It's interesting because there's so many stories constantly about the NDIS, and obviously it is a huge thing to bring into play. Do you think that's starting to undermine the general support the public had for the NDIS, or is it just seen as kind of, you know, fiddling at the edges?
Oh, I think the more that something is kind of, the more bad press something like this gets, I think the more it's going to resonate with people. This isn't my patch, so I'm not hugely kind of cluey on the politics behind the NDIS and exactly what the legislation says and or doesn't say. But my sister is a social worker who deals with people who need housing and who need mental health assistance. And the stories that she has told me about people trying to transition onto the NDIS is it gets to the point where it's just a little bit mind-boggling of how on earth has this happened to the level that it's sort of happened to? And, you know, she's very front-facing, so she sees exactly what it does to people who are in desperate need of attention, not being shepherded and not being stewarded in the right way, and not having the access to the resources. And here's the thing that she says, my sister, the expert, but she says there is so much money that they're not quite sure how and where to spend it, but they need to spend it. So it feels like the money is there, it just doesn't seem to be getting to the right people.
Strange disconnect, isn't it? Well, Rick, you are the expert on this. I mean, we hear so many of these stories. I think all of us have probably heard these stories from people with these personal stories about the nightmare of getting onto the NDIS and that. Do you think these are just the kind of fringe stories? Do you think overall people are better off under the NDIS than they were under the old system?
Look, I think overall, yes, but Kafka would be shedding a tear in his grave. I mean, like, there was a study done out of Flinders University late last year which showed that fully 1 in 5 people are actually worse off under the NDIS. And as far as I'm concerned, if you've got this monumental shake-up of the system and you make a single person worse off, that's bad policy. And we've got essentially at the moment 50,000 people who are doing worse under the NDIS. And that's for a litany of reasons. That's partly due to the intergovernmental agreements between the states and the feds. There are programs that closed, assuming that the people would make it into the NDIS, and they haven't. They have lost. I mean, there are people in the NDIS who started off with fairly great support packages, because that first year there were rivers of gold, and they've had every successive year since they've lost money. And some of them are now on packages that are worth less than that when they were under the old systems. I mean, there are kind of these programs. There's a cost-cutting program within the NDIS that has a name that they don't want to talk about, and I think that was Project Greenlight. So now they're trying to try all these new tools, and it's incredibly...
We're going to have to unfortunately leave it at Project Greenlight.
It's a bureaucratic mess.
That's all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, Tanya, Talal, Jan and Adrian and Rick. Have an excellent evening. Ellen Fanning will be back with you tomorrow night. Thanks again for joining me here on The Drum. Cheers, guys.